We're back to Tucket's Home by Gary Paulson. We're at chapter 6. I think we're going to do chapter 6 and 7. Remember when we left yesterday that Francis had turned the mare around and was racing back to Jason Grimes when the bad guys were attacking him. So here we are. The mare ran hard because it was downhill and because she was fresh and because Francis kept hitting her across the rear with the barrel of his rifle. He knew it did not help. She was running as fast as she could, mouth wide, spit flying back, but he could not help himself. After the first shot, there was a small delay, perhaps 30 seconds, and then a second shot. In those 30 seconds, Francis's pony covered a quarter of a mile. After the second shot, another short delay, and then a third shot, followed by two more in rapid succession. Francis ran toward the gunfire and came around a small stand of aspen into a long, narrow clearing. The grass and trees were green. He would always remember the green. The sun came through the trees, and the light gathered the color and seemed to bathe the whole clearing in a green glow. Everything else seemed frozen, as in a tableau. Tableau is in a tableau. Far down the clearing, near the other end, a horse wandered aimlessly, chewing at grass, still saddled and bridled. The body of a man lay on the ground near the horse. Halfway down the clearing, another horse stood, still saddled and bridled, and beside him another man lay unmoving on the ground in the grass. Closer in, a third horse stood, and on the ground near him a man sat with a red stain on his chest just above the stomach, and he was looking down at it. As Francis watched, he fell over sideways, still looking at the stain. Closer still, near where Francis and the mare came storming out of the tree, a fourth man lay with Grimes' hand axe embedded in his head. Yikes! Nearer yet, almost beneath the pinto's hooves, Grimes knelt with the fifth man, the two of them facing each other. Grimes with his head down slightly as if working, and his hunting knife deep in the center of the man, holding him up in the kneeling position, though the man was clearly dead. All five, Francis thought. He killed all five in not one full minute. Two shot long, one closer in, one with his tomahawk, and the knife at the end. You're something, Francis said, sliding off his horse. You're just something, all five of them. Grimes raised his head, and Francis saw it. Grimes had been hit once across his left shoulder and again through the left side of his chest. When he raised his head, Francis could also see the other man's knife in Grimes' side, up under the left ribs into the lung. I'm shot and cut in pieces, Mr. Tucket. It appears I got my wish. He pushed the other man away and tried to stand, but instead he fell onto his side, and Francis was next to him. What can I do? Grimes seemed not to hear. He struggled to rise, and at last, with Francis helping, he made it to a sitting position. Francis could see blood coming out of the corner of his mouth now, and he knew the mountain man's lungs were gone. Knew it was over. You lie back. Francis moved to help him. We'll make camp here and feed you and make some bandages. You'll be good in a week, maybe two. I'll get some hump meat for you. Grimes shook his head. Let me be. Just let me be. He was quiet again, pulling air hard, leaning against Francis, who was crying openly. Grimes' breathing stopped, and Francis thought he was gone, but it started again, and Grimes said, Don't you bury me. Leave me for the wolves and coyotes. But it isn't don't. I want them to have me and take me on with them. Leave me out of the ground. He was silent for another long time. His breath came ragged, and then he looked at Francis into his eyes, and he said, I wish I could see one more sunrise. And he died then. With Francis holding him in the green light and with the bodies he had conquered all around him, died without closing his eyes. And Francis stared down at him and thought he could not stand it. Some part of what made him alive had been cut out of him with Grimes' death, and he could not hear, and he could not see. And he thought of his love for Grimes and his hatred for the men who had killed him, and of the green light, and of Grimes fighting Braid and trapping beaver and saving Francis from the Pawnees, and again from the Comancheros and from those five men. And he cried, heaving with it, until Lottie and Billy came back to find him and put a blanket over him while he sat for the day and all the night, holding the dead mountain man, crying for what he had lost. Chapter 7. Francis sat his horse on a ridge between two clear white peaks that shot up into a blue sky, and thought of an Indian prayer he'd heard. There is beauty above me, there is beauty below me, all around me there is beauty. The peaks went out ahead of him, as if they were marching to the west. Huge, craggy mountains were still fully coated in snow, and he knew that probably no man from the east had seen them except for Grimes and perhaps other wandering mountain men. Grimes had told him once that Kit Carson had said he'd been out here, but that might have been something Kit made up. The word was he made many things up. "Why are we stopping?" Lottie came up beside Francis. "There's no wood here for a fire, no water for the horses either. Shouldn't we go on down into the valley a little?" Francis shrugged. It had been 4 days since Grimes had died, and Francis was still, as Billy said quietly to Lottie the first night, not right in the head. It was not just the death of Grimes, although that had triggered it. They had done as Grimes had asked and sat him at the base of a tree with his rifle across his lap and his axe and knife close to hand by his side, leaning back against the tree so he could see out across the prairie to the horizon. The other 5 bodies Francis had roped and dragged one at a time to a gully. He'd dumped them in and he left them. He'd searched them first. Even in grief, he could not bring himself to waste anything. They had the rifles they had stolen from the Englishmen, and some gold coins, and the old striker and flint to make sparks and start a fire, but little else. He did not know what to do with the rifles. He was used to his own and did not like the foreign look of them. They were huge, long-barreled affairs, impossible to handle well on a horse, and he offered one to Billy, who picked it up and found that it was much longer than he was tall, and put it down. "I'll stay with my bow," he said. He had hunted with the bows ever since they'd stayed at the Pueblo village, and his arrows kept them in camp meat, turkey, rabbits, squirrels, and even one deer. In the end, they left the rifles near Grimes. The pack horse was already encumbered with food and gold, and the rifles were just extra weight, and they could not carry. And so they had ridden away from Grimes, but Francis could not shake the feeling of an end to some part of his life he could not understand, as if he had somehow died with the mountain man. They had followed the trail Grimes had told them of, but had made slow time because Francis stopped frequently to stare at the peaks and remember his life with Grimes, sometimes dismounting and sitting for half a day, holding the reins to his horse, gazing at nothing. He left everything to Billy and Lottie, setting up camp, killing, cooking meat, and finding the trail, which was not well marked, and even scouting for possible danger. He would stop in the evenings when and where Lottie said to stop, sit while they gathered wood and struck a flint to make fire, eat what Lottie handed him to eat, drink when he was thirsty or not, if water wasn't at hand. On this 4th night, he did not sleep, as he had not slept the previous 3 nights, and on this fourth night, Grimes came to him. Francis was sitting looking into the fire. It had died down to a bed of red coals. Lottie and Billy were wrapped in their blankets, sleeping deeply, turned away from the flames, and Francis wasn't thinking of anything in particular except to wonder if he would ever sleep again, and Grimes came walking in and sat down by the fire pit. Francis jumped back, thinking, a ghost, but Grimes did not show any wounds. He sat quietly for some time looking at the glowing coals, as Francis had been doing, and then he looked up and said softly, as if worrying that he might wake the other two, "It's all right." "What?" Francis leaned toward him. "What did you say?" But Grimes stood, hefted his rifle so that it lay cradled in his one good arm, nodded at Francis, and walked into the darkness without looking back. Francis watched him until he was out of sight, and then he sighed and smiled and lay down on his side and was instantly, profoundly, and deeply asleep. He awakened to find himself covered with a blanket, his rifle at his side. It was still dark, and Lottie had a fire going and was cooking a whole rear leg of venison on a spit over the flames. Francis raised himself on one elbow. "That's quite a bit of meat for breakfast." His voice startled her, and she jumped and scowled at him. "You nearly scared me to death, and for your information, it's not breakfast, this is supper. You slept the clock around all night and all day until next day again." Francis lay back and looked at the fire silently for a time. He did not feel lost as he had before, did not feel ended. He could hear and smell the meat cooking, and he could hear the night sounds around him. Nearby, the horses were standing picketed, and he could hear them breathing. Off to the west, a coyote yipped. "Grimes came to me," he said. "Came to you?" Lottie stopped, turning the meat. "You mean in a dream?" "He means a hain't." Billy was sitting across the fire, wiping grease into the bowstrings. It was made from twisted deer leg tendon, and it dried out if not kept greased. "Grimes came as the hain't, a ghost." "No," Francis sat up. "He came and sat next to me and told me it was all right. Then he got up and left, and then I went to sleep." "It was a haint." Billy repeated. He was worried about you and was coming back to tell you it was all right. Hants ain't all bad. Some of them are good. What do you know about ghosts? Lottie said. It's all stuff and nonsense. If Francis said Grimes came back to him, then Mr. Grimes came back to him. And if he said it's going to be all right, it's going to be all right. You go check the horses. Make sure they're still picketed right, while Francis and me think on what to do next. Billy hesitated, but something in her eye made him think better of speaking, and he went to do as she said. She turned to Francis as soon as the boy was gone. Are you really all right, Francis? Because you haven't been yourself for days and days. He held up his hand. I'm fine. She turned the deer leg slowly, the fat dripping from it into the open flame, sputtered and flashed as it ignited. I was worried about you. He lay back and closed his eyes. I'm all right, don't worry. I'm fine now. We'll eat and sleep another night, and then tomorrow we'll strike north as best we can and see if we can find the wagon trail that Grimes said was there. His stomach rumbled. But for now, how much more are we going to cook that meat? I could eat dirt. Lottie smiled. He was back. Well, that's how you know, I guess, when a man's back is that he's hungry. That's kind of funny. There you go. That was chapter 6 and 7 of Tucket's Home. More later. Bye.